In today's video, I'm going to be teaching you what GraphQL is, why you should be using GraphQL, and by the end of the video, we're going to create this application that you see here, which is a fully functional GraphQL server. Let's get started now. Let's get started by talking about what GraphQL is. You may be thinking that GraphQL is this brand new, really big, complex thing, but in actuality, all GraphQL is a specific way to use tools that we already have. GraphQL is just a specification built around HTTP for how you get and receive resources from a server. Normally, you'll be using something like REST when you interact with a server, and you're using RESTful endpoints and the HTTP post, get, delete, update, all of that fun stuff for HTTP requests using REST. But GraphQL gets rid of the whole idea of REST and all those different endpoints and gives you one single endpoint. And the way you determine what data you get back from that endpoint is based on the query that you send to that endpoint, instead of based on which endpoint you send the data to. So let's look at an example of how a GraphQL query works versus a REST query to get a better idea of the difference between the two. Imagine that you have an application that has books and authors as your two resources, and each of these resources has maybe 15 fields in each one. So a book could have name, description, page count, ISBN, book cover, etc., and same thing with author. And you're building a front-end application where you want to access just the author name and all of the books and their name for that particular author. So you want to get all of the authors and their names and all of the books by all of the authors and just get the name of those books. And you want to display that on your application as quickly as possible for your users. Using a typical REST API endpoint as our first choice, we have two endpoints we can use, which is the authors endpoint to get all of the authors, and then a separate endpoint to get all of the books for a particular author. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to access that authors endpoint to get back a list of all of the authors. And with that list of authors, we're going to be getting back the ID of the authors and the name, which is what we want for our application. But we're also going to be getting back a bunch of extra information, such as where that author lives and how old that author is, which we don't really want for this page that we're displaying. Then, once we have that list of authors, we can take the ID of each author. So for each author we get back, we can call our server again to get the books for that particular author. And then, so if we have 5 authors we get back, we're going to be having to call the API 5 more times to get the books for those authors. And each time we call that, we're going to be getting all the information back for the books, not just the name, even though all we really want is the name. So by using REST API in order to access our data like we're used to, we have to call our API many more times than we really want to, and we also have to get a bunch of extra information back from our server, which we don't actually need. Now, let's look at how GraphQL will handle this situation. With GraphQL, what you do is you compose a query of exactly the data that you want. So you tell GraphQL that you want to get a list of all of the authors, you want their name, and you want to get all of the books for each of the authors and the books' names. You tell GraphQL that single query, which is going to be very small, you send it to the server, and the server, which is your GraphQL server, is going to parse that query and send you back exactly that information. So with just one query to the server, you're going to be getting back a list of all of the authors and their names, and a list of all of their books and their names, and no extra information. You get only the information that you ask for, and you can get as much information as you need, or as little information as you need. This is incredibly powerful and is the real reason that GraphQL is so important and picking up so much speed. The ability to be able to not only query specific information, but also query nested information such as books inside of those authors without having to call your server more than one time is absolutely amazing. And this is really just the beginning of the power that GraphQL has. Since it's built just on the normal HTTP protocol that we already use, we don't have to use anything new or fancy in order to get started with GraphQL, which is amazing. There's also plenty of different libraries out there for tons of different languages that implement all of the GraphQL features for you in an easy-to-use way. In our example later, we're going to take a look at building a GraphQL server using Node.js and Express. Another thing that GraphQL does that's incredibly powerful is it allows you to mutate data on your server. So it allows you to create, update, and delete data just like you could do in a REST API. And the same thing applies to these create, delete, and updates as with your actual GET queries. You can specify exactly what you want to be returned from those queries. Let's say that you're going to be adding a book to a server. You can say that you want to add a book, you give it the name, you give it the author, you give it all the other information you need to. But let's say all you really want back is the name of the book. So you tell it, I want you to add a book with all this information, and then just return back the name for me. So then it'll return you the name of that new book, and maybe you want the ID as well, so it'll return you the name and the ID of that newly created book. This is incredibly powerful. It also has support for errors, so you can do error handling inside of GraphQL, and really it does everything that a REST API can do, except for it makes it so much easier for the front end to work with, and it makes it so much lighter weight since you only have to access the server one time each time you need something instead of multiple times to get all the information you need. So now that we have a basic understanding of what GraphQL is and why it's so powerful, let's get started by building out a Node.js Express application using GraphQL, where we're going to take that book and author example and fully implement the server side of it. To get started, the very first thing that we need to do is actually set up our Express server, which is just going to be a very basic Express server. The first thing that we need to do is to run npm init in order to create our different package.json files, and we can just hit enter a bunch of times here to get all of the default values, and as you can see, we now have a package.json file with all of our information inside of it. Then in here, I'm just going to change our main file to be called server.js because I prefer the name server over index for this instance. Next, we need to install all the dependencies that we're going to be using. Just type in npm I, and then we need to put the different names of our dependencies. In our case, we're going to be using Express. We're going to be using Express GraphQL, which just lets us use GraphQL and Express easily. And we're also going to install a dependency called GraphQL, which is going to give us all of the different functionality that we need in order to use GraphQL. And if we hit enter, let that run, it's going to install all these different dependencies and add them to our package.json file. And now that we have all of those installed, there's one last dependency that we're going to install to make working locally easier, and that's called nodemon. So npm install, and we want to just do this as a dev dependency, so we just say save dev, and we can put in here nodemon, which will allow us to reload our server whenever we save our files instead of having to reload our server manually by stopping it and starting it. And now once that all finishes installing, we're going to create a single script here in order to run our nodemon server. So if we can just type in here dev start, since this is what we're going to use when we do development, we can just say dev start, and we just want to run nodemon server.js. Now that we have that set up, we can create our server.json file over here. Now that we have our server.js file, we can set up just the most basic Express application. So we're going to get Express here from our packages. And then we're going to get the app part of Express. So we just call that Express function to get our app. And we just need to tell our app that we want it to listen on port 5000. And then just so that we know that this is actually running, let's just put a simple function in here that just says that the server is running. And now if we save that and run the command that we created by calling npm run dev start, since we called the dev start, and we hit enter, you should see that it says that our server is running. And if we go to localhost 5000, you'll see that it says cannot get index because we don't actually have any routes created, but we do know that our server is now running. So let's actually work on adding GraphQL into our server. In order to do that, we need to require GraphQL. So we need to require our Express GraphQL, which we imported earlier with our package.json. So we just type that in, Express GraphQL, just like that. And we can actually add a root for our application. So we can just say app.use, and we want this to be at GraphQL. So when we go to /GraphQL, localhost 5000 /GraphQL, it's going to run the code in here. And we can just say Express GraphQL. And in here, we just leave an empty object for now since we don't have anything actually to pass to it, other than the fact that we want to say graphical, we want to pass true to this, which is going to give us an actual user interface to access our GraphQL server without having to manually call it through something like Postman. Now if we save that and go to that URL, GraphQL, you'll see that we get an error saying that we need a schema for our GraphQL. And the way that GraphQL knows which data to access based on the query that you send it is you have to define a schema of how all of your data interacts together. And that schema is what we need to pass into our Express GraphQL function so that our Express GraphQL knows what our actual GraphQL data looks like. So let's just create a dummy query here to see how this works. So in order to create a query, we actually need to import a few things into our application. So if we go up here, we can say that we want to import a few different things from the library of GraphQL that we mentioned earlier. And we want to import our schema first of all. So there's an object called GraphQL schema. And we also want to import the object type, because in GraphQL, everything is actually strongly typed. So an object type just allows you to create a dynamic object full of a different other types. So in here, we can just say GraphQL object type, and that'll be an actual object type that we can import. And now we need to create a new schema. So we'll just call our schema here equal to a new GraphQL schema, and in here is where we define our actual schema. So like I said, we're just going to be creating a dummy schema here. So the first thing we want to do is define the query section, which is essentially the getting of data. So we'll define the query parameter here, and we want to set this query here equal to a new GraphQL object type. And inside of this object type, we're just going to give it a name of hello world. And in here, we need to define the fields that hello world returns. So we can say fields, and we just set this to a function here. So we'll just create a function, and inside of this function, we actually return the different fields that we want to return. So in our case, we're just going to be returning an object, and this is just going to have message here. And this message is actually going to be an object, which is going to define the type of our message. So we just put an object in here, and we know that we want the type of this to be a string. So we need to actually import the GraphQL string object. So up here, we can just say GraphQL string, import that, and then we can use that as our type down here for our message. So now GraphQL knows that our hello world object has a message field, and that message field is going to return a string. And then lastly, we needed to tell GraphQL where to get this message from. So in our case, we just want to give it a static message of hello world, and this is going to use the resolve section of this object, which is just going to be a function that tells GraphQL where to get the information from. So we just have a simple function here, and this function is just going to return hello world. Now, if we actually pass that schema into our function down here by saying schema, and we call that object schema. So now if we save that and refresh over here, you'll see that we get this GraphQL interface over here, and you'll notice immediately that we get an error saying that the name for our hello world does not actually work because it contains a space which is not valid. So we'll just remove the space here and resave it. And if we refresh this, you'll see that we no longer get any errors in our GraphQL server. And we can actually query our GraphQL server. And we can even look at the docs over here. And as you can see, it says that we have a single query called hello world, which returns a message that's a string. So let's call that query. We just have to say query. And inside of our brackets here, we want to put what we want to query. In our case, we just want to query the message. And if we hit run, you'll see we get message hello world back. And we can actually remove query here because by default, GraphQL will use the query keyword instead of actually adding data. So if we run this again, you'll see that we get our message back. Even though we didn't specify that it's a query, that is just the default. And from this very simple example, we can already kind of dissect how this GraphQL library works and how we can use it to build larger applications. So the first thing that you see here is that we have our schema, which defines our query section, and this query section defines all of the different use cases that we can use for querying. In our case, this will be authors and books in our real application, but for now, it is just a single hello world object. Next, inside of each of our different objects, we have what are called fields, which are all of the different sections of that object that we can actually query to return data from. In our case, just a single field of message. But for a book, this could be the name of the book, the ISBN, the cover art of the book, and so on. And then we have a resolve function down here, which is going to be what actual information are we returning for this field? How do we actually get the information for this field and return it? This resolve function also comes with a few arguments, such as the parent that it's being called from, and different arguments that you pass to your query. But in our case, we don't really need to worry about those for this simple example. But as we can already see from just this really simple example, we can build out pretty much any type of object that we want just by passing it the different fields, telling it what types those different fields are, and then resolving those fields to a specific type if need be. If, for example, our GraphQL object is returning an object, a JSON object, the resolve will automatically default to that value on the object. So if we have an object with a property of message on it, we don't actually need to put resolve here because resolve will already call the message attribute of that object. We'll see that later on as we dive into this book and author example. So now that we have this finished up with our early example, let's dive directly into creating these author and books example. The first thing that I'm going to do is just paste in some placeholder data that we're going to be using in our application. This is just data for 3 different authors and 8 different books associated with those 3 different authors. And we're just going to be using this in place of something like a database because we don't actually want to worry about hooking up a database for this simple application. And these 2 collections of data, this authors variable and this books variable, will just be our database for this application. Next, we're going to want to create what's called a root query scope. Essentially, this is just going to be the root query that everything is going to pull down from. Right now, our root query is just this single hello world object, but as you can see, we can only query from this hello world object the messages field. And we want to be able to query books, authors, single authors, and so much more from this root query object. So we want just one place where we can define all of the different objects that we can query from our GraphQL server here. So let's remove what we have right now and create that root query type. So we can just say, create a variable, we'll call it root query type. And this is just going to be an object. So we can just set it to a new GraphQL object type. And this works just like the object type we just created. But instead of using hello world as the name, we're just going to give it a name of query, since this is just our query. We can give it a description, which will show up in our documentation over here. Right now it says no description, so we can just give this a description here of root query so that we know this is the top level. And then our root query is where we can define our actual fields. So we'll just pass this a function. And the reason I'm wrapping this function in parentheses, this return here, is so that I don't actually need to add a return statement, since this will just return everything inside of the parentheses, which is just this single object. So it's just saving us a little bit of writing there. And what we want to do is we want to actually return books from this query. So we can say we want to return a list of books, which is going to be this books keyword here. And we just need to supply a different object for this, and we need to give it a type. And in our case, books is just going to be a custom GraphQL object type. So we want to create that GraphQL object type. We'll just call it book type, but we haven't created it yet, but this is just a placeholder for that type we will be creating. We'll then give it a description here, and we're just going to give this a description of a list of books. And then we need to do resolve for this. So in our case, this resolve is just going to be extremely straightforward. It's just going to return that book object that we had. If you had, for example, a database here, you would query the database for your books, but in our case, we're just returning that single object. And instead of actually returning a single book type, we're returning what's called a list of book types. So we need to actually import the GraphQL list object. So we have GraphQL list here, and now we can use that GraphQL list, wrap our book type inside of it. So we just say new GraphQL list, and we pass it the actual type for that list. So this is a list of book types. So now that we have our books query defined here, let's actually define the book type that we'll be using for this query. So as we already know, this book type is just going to be a custom object. So we can create a variable called book type, set it equal to that new GraphQL object type, since this is a custom object. And in here, we need to do the same thing. We need to give it a name, which in our case is just going to be called a book. Give it a description. This is just going to say this represents a book written by an author. And we need to specify the fields for the book. So again, pass this a function, wrapping it in those parentheses so we can just return that object. And in here, we need to define our fields. As you can see, we have our ID field, our name field, as well as our author field. So let's specify those now. We have ID. This is going to be the type of GraphQL int, which we haven't actually imported yet. And this is just saying that this is going to be an integer. So let's import this type up here. And one other thing we need to import is what's called the GraphQL non-null. And essentially this means that you can never return a null value for this type. An integer is always going to be supplied. It's never going to be null. So we can actually just wrap this in a new GraphQL non-null. Actually, you don't even need the new here. So we just say GraphQL non-null GraphQL int. And that's the type of our ID. And we don't actually need to supply a resolve for our ID, because as I said earlier, since we have an object here that already has an ID property, it'll pull that ID property directly from that object. So the next thing we want to do is add the name in here. which is going to be very similar to the ID, but the type in here instead is going to be a GraphQL string. And again, it's going to be non-nullable. So we got the non-null, and that's all we need to do. We don't need to add a resolve again for this. And lastly, we have our author ID, which is going to be exactly the same as our int for our ID up here. So we can just copy and paste that down. And there we go. We have our full book type already defined. So now that we have our root query type, which is using our book type, we just need to create a schema and then use that schema. So just create a variable here called schema. We're going to set it to a new GraphQL schema. And this schema, as I said, it's going to take a query object, and this is just going to be our root query type. Now, if you save that, you see that we get no errors. And if we come over here and refresh our page, remove all this code that we have, so we just have a blank start, you can see our documentation explorer, we have this query object, and inside of here, we have books, which will allow us to get a list of books. And we can go through and see what a book is. It's integer, name, author ID, and so on. So let's actually use this. So as we know, we need to put these inside of curly braces, and all we do is say books, and then we specify the fields for the books we want. So let's say we just want to get the name of every book. If we run that, you see over here, we get the name of every single book that's in our list right up here. And as you can see, it's the same exact list. We can also get ID, for example, and we just hit go, and you see now we get the ID and the name. And if we didn't want name, just remove that, hit run, and there you go. Now we're just getting the IDs. And the syntax over here for searching GraphQL is very similar to JSON-like syntax, but you're only specifying the keys. You're not really specifying the values of it. So as you can see here, we're saying that we want to get books, and in the books, we want to get all the different IDs. And if we want to get author ID, for example, we can run that in here. And there we go. Now we're getting the author ID for all the different books, and it's really powerful. But what if we wanted to get the author, and we wanted to get the name of the author, for example, just like this? Right now, our server can't actually handle this because we don't have an author field on books. So let's work on adding that into our application. So all we need to do is add another field here that's going to be author, and we need to give it a type. And this type is going to be a new type. This is going to be an author type. Just like we have our book type, this is going to be an author type. And since our actual array of data up here, as you can see for books, doesn't have an author field, we need to specify a custom resolve for how we get this author. So let's add our resolve, make it a function here. And this function, we just want to return here. We want to search the authors, and we want to find the author, and we want to find the author with the ID from the book. But how do we get the book that this is being called? As I mentioned earlier, this resolve takes a parent property here, which in our case is just going to be a book. So this author is inside of this book type. So this is going to get the book passed in here that is being queried for this field. So we can just check when this author ID is equal to the book author ID. Then we know that this is the author for the book. And now what we need to do is create this author type so that we can actually return it. And we're just going to do that exactly like we created the book type here. I'm actually just going to copy this because a lot of it is going to be exactly the same. So we know that our author has an ID, it has a name, it's not going to have an author ID, and it's not going to have an author. So we can remove those sections for now. And we just need to change the type here. Author, change the name of the variable to be author type. And we just want to change the description because it's going to be representing an author of a book. And now, if we save that, you'll see that everything runs fine over here. And if we refresh over here, you now see that we're getting the authors inside of our books array. And this is where the power of GraphQL really comes into play. All we had to do was define this author type, define this book type, and tell the book type how to get the actual author from the book. And there we go, our authors are being populated. And if we don't want authors, we can just remove that from our query, and we're no longer getting the author data, and it no longer has to call this function. You really start to be able to think of your data in graph form, because as you can see when we look at our docs over here, the start of our graph is this query object, and then we have a new node for books, and this book returns books, and in here our book has an author, and as you can see it kind of just graphs down through all of our different objects, and we can slowly query down to more and more specific sections of our application. But as you can see, we don't have a query for authors yet, so let's add that authors query in. And it's going to be incredibly simple. We just go to our root query, and right now we have a books query. let's just copy that, and we'll just add in a query here for getting the authors. And we want the type here to be author type instead of book type. It's going to get a list of all authors, and instead of returning books, we just return authors. Now, if we come in here, we can query our authors instead of our books, if I spell it right. Query authors, and we want to get the name, for example, and if you run that, you see that works. And the reason it's showing an error is I just need to refresh our page so that it actually knows what the syntax is. This is just a problem with GraphQL. So now you can see we're able to query the authors and their names. We can put in the ID here, for example, but let's go back to our earlier example where we said that we wanted to get a list of all the authors and a list of all the books for each author. Right now, we can't do that because if we try to query the books, for example, and get the name of all the books, and we run that, you see that there's no books field for author. So let's add that in now. We just need to go up to our author type here, add a new field, which is going to be called books. And this field is going to be a list type. So again, we can use that GraphQL list that we talked about earlier, give it the book type, since we want to have a list of books, and then we just need to pass it a resolve function. So we pass it resolve, give it a function definition here, and this is just going to return all the books for the author. So again, we have that parent method in here, which is just the author, since we're inside of that author type, and I just want to return, so we search our books list, filter that books list, and we just want to get it where the books.id for the author is equal to the author.id. And this is just going to get us a list of all the books for the author. And now if we save that, refresh over here, you now see that we get a list of all of the books for each author, and that's perfect. This is one single query that we're running here, and in a normal REST API, this would require us to run one query for the authors, another query for the books for author 1, author 2, and author 3, so that would be 4 queries total, and it would return us a bunch of information that we don't actually want, such as the ID of the book and the author ID of the book. But what if we want to just get one single author instead of getting a list of all the authors every time? Well, that's also incredibly easy to do with GraphQL because we can actually pass arguments to our GraphQL methods here. So let's look at doing that. If we go down to our root query here, we can just define a new query. So instead of querying books, let's say we just want to query a single book. And this is going to work very similarly to books here. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it down here. And we aren't returning a list this time. We're just returning a single book type. So we can change the description here as well to just say a single book. And instead of returning books here, we don't return just a single book based on the argument we pass in. So in our case, this resolve is going to take our parent, which in our case we don't actually want, but the second parameter here is arguments. And we're going to pass in our arguments from GraphQL over here. So we want to define which arguments are valid for our query. And we do that using the args parameter. And this again just takes an object, and this object defines our arguments. So we want to pass in the ID of the book we want to query. And we just need to give it a type here. So we can just say the type here is a GraphQL int. And now we've actually defined that this book query right here for a single book takes one single argument of ID. And in here, we can actually use that ID argument to query our books. So we can just say books.find. We want to get the book with that ID. So args.id is going to be that ID argument we defined right here. And this is just going to get a single book based on that ID. Again, if you had a database, you would do database queries in order to get this. And now if we go over here into GraphQL, refresh it so that we get our syntax highlighting, we can query book, and we just pass an ID in here of, let's say we want to get the very first one, ID 1, and we want to get the name of that book. If we run it, we see that we get Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And if you look up here, that is the book with an ID of number 1. And we can even get the author of that book. So we can just say author, and we want to get the name of that author, and it gets the name of the author for us perfectly fine. As you can see, we didn't have to touch these GraphQL object types here. We defined our types once, and then we actually use those types in various different ways with our different queries. And that is something that makes GraphQL really powerful. It makes creating endpoints really simple since you don't have to spin up new routes and everything to create an endpoint. You just create a single query field, which you're going to query for that actual object. And once that object's defined, you don't actually need to do any hard work to redefine how that object's used for the new query. You just use that object that's already defined. And we can do this exact same thing for authors for getting a single author. So let's copy this authors down and change it for getting a single author. As we know, we no longer need a list. We can just get a single author type, change our description here to be a single author, and we want to define our arguments. So in our case, our arguments here are just going to be an ID, which is going to have the type of GraphQL int. And lastly, inside of a resolve function here, we just want to find the author with that ID. So we say author.id is equal to args.id. And there we go. We've created our syntax or our function here for querying an author. So let's do that. Let's just go author. We want ID 2, for example, and we want to get their name. Now, if we run that, you see that we get an error, and that's because in our resolve function here, we actually need to specify that we're using the arguments. And now if we save that and rerun it, you'll see that we're actually getting the author. And if we look, that is the author with the ID of 2 here, which is exactly perfect. And now, before we jump into actually modifying data on the server, I want to mention one thing about how fields is returning a function instead of an actual object. Because as you can see, all it's doing is returning a function that returns an object. And the reason we can't return just an object here instead of a function that returns an object is that this book type references author type. So we need book type to be defined before author type. But author type defines book type, so we need author type to be defined before book type. So if we don't have this inside of a function here, and we try to run it, you'll see that we get an error saying that it can't actually find author type because author type is after book type. So you may think, okay, we'll move author type to be above book type. So now book type or author type can find book type. But if we save that, you'll see that we get a new error, and that error is saying book type's not defined, and that's because book type is inside of author type, and they reference each other. So that's why we use a function, so that everything can get defined before they actually start getting called. So let's just undo all of that back to where we were with using functions. And now if we save that, we should get no more errors, and this should still work. Perfect. Now we can jump into actually modifying our data, which is what we use mutations for. Mutations are GraphQL's version of using post, put, and delete on a REST API server. So we actually want to create a new object type, which is going to be just like our root query type, but this is going to be our root mutation type, because our schema actually down here takes what's called a mutation. So we're going to pass it our root mutation type, which we are going to create. So right below our root query type here, let's create a new type called root mutation type. And this again is just going to be a GraphQL object type. Lots of things in GraphQL are just custom objects full of different parameters, such as integer, string, and so on. So really, it's just typing out your different objects is what GraphQL is all about. So in here, again, we want to put a name. We'll just call it mutation, since it's our root of our mutations. Description, it's going to be root mutation. And then we can define the different fields. And these are essentially the different operations that we want to do for our different mutations. And again, we're going to pass it a function, as I mentioned earlier. And here first, let's work on adding a book to our database. So we can use add as the name of our field, which is just going to be the name that we pass in over here. So instead of author, this would say add book. And we define this just like any other field. So we give it a type. In our case, adding a book is going to return a book type for us. Give it a description, just say add a book. And then we want to pass args because we actually need data to pass to the server for us to add a book. In our case, we only need 2 parameters. We need a name, first of all, for what the book is going to be called. And this is going to be a type, which is going to be a string type. But again, we don't want people to pass in a null value for name. Name needs to be required. So we need to say that it is non-null, and we need to wrap that inside of that non-null. And we want to do the exact same thing for the author ID. So instead of using name here, we'll use author ID, and instead of string, an author ID is going to be an integer. And then our resolve function, instead of actually querying to return data, it's going to add data to our list. So we can say resolve. We are going to use parent and args here again, because we want to be able to access that args parameter. And then the first thing we want to do is we want to create a book. So we'll create a book object. It's going to have an ID, which is just going to be the length of our books array plus 1. If you had a database, this would be automatically generated, so you really don't need to worry about this too much. Our name is going to be args.name, and our author ID is going to be args.author ID, if I can spell that properly. There we go. So now we have our book created, and now we need to add that book to our array. So we can say books.pushBook. This is just going to add that book to our array of books we already have, and then we can return that book, since this is actually returning a book object. And if we save that, refresh GraphQL over here, and we try to use that function of addBook, we call addBook, you can see it's not actually here. It's not actually highlighting addBook. And that's because by default, GraphQL uses a query, and we want to use a mutation. Now we have our addBook showing up here, and we just pass in our different parameters. We'll pass in a name, for example. We'll just call it new name. And one thing to note here is you need to use double quotes for specifying strings, because GraphQL uses syntax very similar to JSON. So single quotes will not actually work. So we pass it the name. We're going to pass it the author ID, which we'll just use as 1 for now. And then what parameters we want to be returned. In our case, we'll just return the name and the ID for our book. Now if we run that, you see we get an ID of 9 and a name of new name, which if we look up at our array over here, we see that the ID of 9 is the next in the list, which is perfect. So now if we go to query all of our different books, and if we just want to get the ID and the name, and we run that, you see that we now get our 9th book down here with that new name that we specified. Now, as soon as we restart our server, this is going to be disappeared because we're not actually persisting to a database, but you can see how this works for if you wanted to use it in a real application with a database, you wouldn't have to worry about that problem of it disappearing. So now we can do the exact same thing with author, and it's going to be very similar to how we used for books. So let's just copy everything we have for add book, but instead of calling it add book, we're going to call it add author, and it's going to be an author type. It's going to add an author. We have our name, which is what we're going to add, and we don't actually have anything else that we need to add for an author. And our resolve down here is going to look very similar, but instead of being a book, we're going to be creating a new author. It's going to be authors.length for the ID, and we don't actually have an author ID for our author, and we want to add this to our authors array instead of to our book array, and then return that author. And there we go, we've created for adding an author. If we save it, we get no errors, and we can go in here, run the mutation for adding an author, and if we just refresh here, we'll actually get our syntax highlighting. We want to add it with a name, and we'll just say new author is going to be our name, and we want to return the name and the ID of that author. And if we run it, you see that we get that author, the ID, and the name of that author. And now we can actually query all of our authors, and we can get the ID and name, run that, and there we go, we have our 4th author that we just added. And this even still works if we wanted to get the books, for example, except for this new author just doesn't have any books, so it returns an empty array. And everything works perfectly fine. And this works just like a REST API would have. We have the ability to create things, we have the ability to read things, and we can even add the ability to update things, which is going to work exactly the same as the adds, except for you would change this to update, you would pass in an ID, and then you would do an actual update of the instance in the database. The really great thing though about this GraphQL instance is that it's incredibly small. This entire thing, our server, including our models, is 135 lines, and a lot of that is taken up here with the actual data that we imported into our application. So essentially, in about 100 lines, we're able to fit our entire application code for creating a simple author and book API, which is incredibly powerful. You couldn't do this in a REST API in such a short amount of space. Also, on the server or on the client side, you're able to query exactly the data that you want to. In our case, we can query just the author's ID, name, and all their books in their name in one single query. So the information being sent to the client is so much smaller and so much more specific, and it's easier to work with since you don't have to create a bunch of custom endpoints every time you want to get a different set of data back. You just tell the server you want different data, and it gives it to you. It just is smart enough to know that. And that's all the basics of what you can do with a GraphQL server. Using these tools in this video, you can create an infinitely large GraphQL server that can do everything from updating to deleting to creating to getting data in a much more efficient and faster way than a REST API ever could. If you guys did enjoy this video, please make sure to check out my other JavaScript related videos over here. and subscribe to my channel for more videos just like this. Thank you guys very much for watching, and have a good day.